So before we get deeper into China, we wanted to re-show this slide from segment 1 that just highlights the problems that exist right now on just the drought. And again, that huge, gigantic blob and just what that means for farming. And not only just farming, but the industrial components that are impacted by the lack of power. And that's one of the key pieces, because the Yangtze has a lot of hydro dams on it. 18% of their green energy is hydro. So it's going to be impactful, not only just from their ability to grow, but also their ability to manufacture and the speed in which they can manufacture. So there's a lot of things that have come into it with Premier Li taking aim at it with the devastating drought. A severe drought has dried up the Yangtze at what is usually the wet season's peak, with devastating impacts to farmers, businesses, and communities that rely on the water, to the point that they've started digging some of the tributaries deeper to get some of that additional water that has moved down, but draining that water even further, making the problem worse, which again kind of comes back to some of the different issues. And then the emergency drought response. So pulling out all the stops to boost water supply, adjusting reservoir management, drilling wells to access groundwater, and generating artificial rain. They've actually started seeding clouds to try to force rain to come through, while prioritizing drinking water for people and doing everything possible to ensure crops are irrigated to preserve the fall harvest, because they're already spending so much money to subsidize food and try to corner or stop some of that market. Also announced new central funding for farmers. $10 billion will be earmarked as emergency drought relief for farms in the region. Li told local governments they too must commit more funds to drought relief. The next 5 months are typically the dry season in the region. So the problem is it's only going to get worse from this point in the near term, unless the wet season became the dry season becomes the wet season. But you get an idea of the problems that are really starting to roll out. And for those that have watched us from the beginning, in 2020 we talked about massive flooding that destroyed a lot of these crops and this farmland with too much water. Now we have the complete opposite, which is, again, those extremes that we're experiencing in today's world. So the next 5 months are the typical dry period, which is that's reasonably good news for agriculture. If crops survive the next few weeks, most won't be at risk for the drought unless it persists next spring, because you're coming into the harvest. But it's bad news for everything else that uses water, including, again, the the industrial side, but also, as we've been talking about, the industrial footprint, because 55% of industrial production comes from this region. So, but when you look at it, with some 400 million people living along the Yangtze, the human and economic fallout is going to be disastrous if the drought continues to extend. So now when we start looking at, okay, well, we know what we've been talking about from the construction side. So let's look at heavy machinery. So this is, again, looking at construction drives imports of commodities, machinery, chemicals. So we know that. But what has happened to it? Where has that gone since that point? And here you can see floor space under construction has gone down. So chemicals and plastics, mineral products, all of that has diminished because, again, they're just not consuming the same amount. So some of that is going to, again, turn into the export market. And that's where, when you look at India, they've complained that China's been dumping. And I think that's the underlying problem. And it's not surprising to hear that there are 19 new measures to boost growth. So again, they're coming into a very important Communist Congress. So Li said Beijing will implement 19 new measures. So increasing the quota of policy and development finance tools to 300 billion renminbi. So remember, it was initially 150, 200. Now it's 300. But when we showed you the math, they would need trillions. So again, you're still at a drop in the bucket given the issues that are mounting here, putting the outstanding renminbi 500 billion quota in special purpose bonds to use by the end of October. But remember, they missed their quotas in 2021 for special purpose bonds. So now they're going to rely on them again, even though they didn't use up all of them last year, because there's no projects. So now there were no projects in 21. Now you have projects that can't fund themselves, but you want them to. So again, you're in a cyclical piece that just doesn't make sense. Supporting state-owned power companies to issue 200 billion renminbi in special purpose bonds to ensure power supply. Again, you can say it, but where are you going to build it? Because they're already building new coal plants. They're already building new plants. So you want them to build more? It's just you're decreasing the efficiency of it, and you're just increasing the bad debt expense. So additionally, the increased effective investment and consumption and help with insufficient demand for loans. Again, there is no demand for loans. We have shown that multiple times with credit impulses, private impulses, domestic, state impulses. State-owned entities are the only ones that are taking this down, and it's because they're just flipping it. And the last bit is important right now, but it's unclear as to, again, they keep saying it, but who's borrowing it? The State Council will send supervisors to major economic provinces to ensure that projects are approved and implemented ASAP. Top leadership is acknowledging the sources of the sluggish recovery, tepid consumption, insufficient credit demand, lack of outlets for stimulus funds, because everybody is levered to the gills. The consumer, the industrial sector, the private sector, the tech sector. There is not an area in China that hasn't been stuffed with debt. And that's the law of diminishing returns. Who is your buyer of last resort? And they've been using the consumer over and over again, and they are tapped out. So while this is a forceful show from Lee and marks the next leg in Beijing's approach to economic support, it's will this boost growth? Will this boost the amount of credit impulse? But when you look at major economies exposed to China's construction cycle, so it's not only just the issues that remain in China, they're not really going to be able to move this through, because again, this is exactly what they've done since 2008. And it worked. I am not saying it didn't work. It has worked multiple times since 2008. They have effectively bailed out the global economy 3, and I would argue 4 times since 2008. But at some point, that law of diminishing returns, that next incremental dollar is negative, and that's where we are right now. So then when you look at the major economies that are exposed to China's construction cycle, it's important because everyone keeps saying, oh, it's just China's problem, it's internal. Or, oh, it's just local debt, they can figure it out. They can't. A lot of other countries rely on Chinese consumption, and Chinese consumption isn't there. So this is where we have more and more problems on these knock-on effects, these ripple effects. And to think that the second largest economy in the world can just not impact anyone else with a local debt problem is not, and again, not to say it is local, it's global, but just to say that it's local and it's not going to impact things, I just, each to their own, I guess. So here, when you look at China fiscal deficit to GDP ratios, you're getting an idea of the deficit and the projected. So when you look at the deficit to GDP expansion on the trillions of yuan each year, it continues to get worse because it's compounding. All of this debt keeps building, and there's so much of it that they can't even place it. So here's, I think, the key piece to break it down a bit differently now that you can kind of see where the projected number is. So the deficit to GDP ratio, considering all unspent amount in 2021. So if they try to spend everything that wasn't spent in 21, you're really not adding new, you could say that the new spending that was announced is just the old spending from 21 that the market assumed went in, that you saw it go in, and now through audits, which as we've been saying since last year, it didn't. Now you're starting to see that add up and create some of these meaningful problems. The package contains the growth. It approves more projects and allocates another 300 billion yuan to seed more. Together with 300 billion yuan allocation set in June, there's now 600 billion that can be used to meet a minimum capital requirement for new infrastructure projects of 20% to 25%. The funds can be leveraged up to 5 to 6 trillion yuan, 5% of GDP in infrastructure investment over the course of multi-year project horizons, but could start to deliver a kick this year. So you're looking at a country and banks and companies that are already over levered. Now you're going to give them the ability to leverage again. So you're going to have leverage on top of leverage on top of leverage, and that's not going to make the situation worse, is essentially what we're seeing, because they're trying to put more cash behind it, securitize the bad debt that's already there, try to minimize the bad debt expense while leveraging it further down the road. So you're just taking the leverage, you're removing it from this year and spreading it over the next 5 years. But you've done that how many times, and who is buying the units? Who is buying the land? Who's buying? So again, you can do this and you can build it, but who is your buyer? What entity is going to own that at the end of it? And that's where we continue to struggle. The package also gives local governments leeway to borrow more. Local governments get an additional 500 billion yuan quota for special purpose bond issuance. That's on top of the 3.775 trillion yuan quota for 2022. The extra quota draws on resources that were budgeted but not used in previous years. Expect the government to tap those resources to boost spending leeway without blowing out its 2022 budgets. So they're going to borrow from one budget to dump into another budget. The extra fiscal measures will widen the broad measure of the budget deficit to 6.2% of GDP in 22, and to as much as 8.2% of GDP if last year's unspent funds are utilized. The package also includes other targeted measures, state power, again, like state power companies to issue special bonds, as we've been talking. But what the package does not include is the more significant factor in estimating its effectiveness. So this is when you start looking at who is the buyer. So references to the housing market, again, it doesn't have teeth, because who's buying? How are you getting that person to purchase it? It did mention the need for reasonable support for housing demand, a more positive stance than a previous focus on stamping it out. There were no indications that the government might go easier when implementing COVID-0, which is obviously the issue. The package should yield some benefits, but still misses the bigger problem: weak private demand and shattered confidence. And again, that's what we've been driving home. These quotes are coming from Bloomberg, which I think did a good job of outlining this. And again, the economy requires a confidence lift, but also the consumer. And they keep trying. Again, dual circulation strategy, common prosperity. They're still not adjusting that expansion. And yes, they're going to try the old adage of, oh, well, just invest in infrastructure, but we've already seen all of those deals that have been done since 1819 that are now underwater. They have a multiplier of 0.86. They're not generating growth, which is, I think, the bigger concern here. And then when you, again, pull out a bit and look at dismal sentiment among Chinese households and enterprises. So the marginal propensity to spend indicator for households is at a record low. It's the lowest it's ever been. And again, you can see it's only gone straight down since 2020, but it's waffled back and forth. Now, when you look, I can remember in 2008, then they did it in 2014, then they did it again in 2016. You had multiple periods where the government has stepped in, and that has helped bail out the world. And non-financial enterprises, their propensity to spend is at the lowest ever. So the consumer and the non-financial enterprise. So who is the buyer of last resort? Who's going to take this money and spend it? Growth slump, again, the forecast is down to 3.8%. As you know, we are lower than that. We're closer to about 1.82%. We think there is more downside. And again, the 1.82%, we think it's negative, but they'll never put a negative number out there. So we're trying to factor in based on what they've shown, the stimulus they're putting through, the government spending that's coming on. That should be able to, again, kind of buffer that. And let's be honest, we think it's going to be below 2020, but not by much. Like that, I think, is the target that they will accept as possible, given all of the issues that are hitting. Business impacts are mounting as heat and drought continue to hurt much of Central and South China. So when you think about all of the things they're doing, they also have a massive drought to deal with that is just exasperating the issues. And if you think back to the 1930s, and again, remember, we've been saying that this decade is going to be a weird amalgamation of the 30s and 70s. We had a Dust Bowl in the 30s, and it lasted years. And you're seeing something very similar in terms of the pain that brought about with it. So the Yangtze River Maritime Safety Administration announced water levels are so low that river sea shipping to and from Wuhan's major port is no longer safe. The port is usually open for ocean-going cargo until October. Now ocean-going ships must unload downstream and distribute cargoes between a few riverine boats. That extends shipping times at least 5 days, adds costs. Again, inflation, and things that we are going to import as an inflation, because these are things destined for the export market. Central Asia is weathering the hottest summer and the deepest drought since record keeping began 61 years ago. And again, when you look at prioritized drinking water, so all of these impacts also have to be addressed while trying to stimulate, and you're seeing kind of the circular problem that exists. So the China PBoC has cut rates again. They took the loan prime rate to 3.65%, down 5 basis points, and the 5-year down 15 basis points, in the hope of not only the fiscal side, but making some of the debt cheaper. But it's not so much that it's too expensive; it's that they don't have the balance sheet capacity to take it, which becomes the overarching issue. Chinese banks face growing bad loan exposure pressure as economy slows. So the bad debt expense is going up. So what they're trying to do is bring that back down and trying to make this a bit more comfortable. And that's, again, the problems that we keep seeing and the issues that remain across the board. So, and even though they're trying to do this, the bad debt expense isn't going away because prices are falling still. So you have to write down the asset, which is going to increase your bad debt expense and make your leverage ratios look worse because the value of what is backing it has diminished again. Infrastructure bonds, China adds 500 billion yuan of local government special bonds for 2022. Official quota for new special local bonds, addition from unused quotas. Again, that's just what they're trying to put back out there. All the while, sales managers index, you can see, has fallen again, continues to drop. Business confidence bumping along the lows. Other businesses, as we've been discussing, other metrics have shown this negative. Market growth index bounced, but still down. And then when you start looking at sales growth, prices charged have diminished, again, trying to get that protection. Staffing levels, though, down again, which is a huge issue. Again, a huge problem when you look at confidence in spending, because if you don't have a job, well, are you going to spend? And that's, again, profit margins continue to be under pressure. Manufacturing sector in August, business confidence and market growth indexes have bounced as you've had some reopenings, some exports, but the service side has diminished considerably. And that's the biggest concern right now, is because now you have manufacturing side with prices going through the roof because of the loss of electricity, increase in prices, and then slowing global economy, which is going to push that further, while service sector continues to remain, I don't think it goes much further, but just stays at a very depressed level, keeping pressure on the underlying economy. So when you look at, is a recovery in China's business cycle imminent? This is just trying to look at what they're attempting to do with that activity and the credit and fiscal side. And you can see here on the left side, when you look at where they're trying to push things up, and this is the importance of separating it, as we've been discussing. When you look at it holistically and the SOEs is driving this. But when you look at the private side, which is taking negative 15% additional, so they're taking 15% less than before, that's where we see that overhang, and we see it kind of flatlining after this initial pop, which they've gotten from all of this spending. And you're just seeing that all of this spending to this point, and this is all we've achieved, which gives you an idea, again, the law of diminishing returns. So there has been no recovery in China without a revival in real estate. And because of everything we've discussed, we don't see a revival in real estate sales, in values, in pricing, And that's going to impact the consumer further because they have 67 to 70% exposure to the real estate as wealth driver, which is going to keep things muted. Which is here, China real estate loans is negative month over month, and this is the first time it has happened in over a decade. To give you an idea on pain, China's household loan to debt ratios starting to turn cautious and roll over as, again, people don't want new loans and their deposit ratios are going up because people are saving, not spending. People's Bank of China Income Confidence Index is back to the lows of 2020, and based on services, based on manufacturing, based on drought, and just companies shutting. We've talked about fertilizer companies are cutting runs. Refiners are cutting run rates. You're seeing manufacturing cutting run rates because of all of these low river levels, which is going to keep that as under wraps. And China net in household deposits have gone up because they're not spending and they're just saving due to all of these uncertainties. So there is a certain amount that you can get a pop if people get confident, if all of these things shift. But as things even shift there, you're going to have the global weight of exports and the global issues on manufacturing and the global price increases that we've seen on energy and electricity and food, which is going to be that overhang. Japan's CPI, on the other hand, inflation was a bit higher than expected last month, with the core CPI hitting 1.2% for the first time since 2016. So again, all of these inflationary pieces abroad, which continue to move up, continue to drive higher, the U.S. is going to import that. We're importers of inflation at this point on both the reshoring side as well as product side, which is why, again, giving some of that stagflation because of some of those tailwinds. Now on the other side, India's sales manager index, slightly better, still negative, but improving with business confidence growth getting better in August, which has supported some of the metrics within India. But when you start looking at a broader piece where inflation is still elevated, they're still running at a high deficit, and rates continue to go up as the dollar remains over 108 and more pressure, that's where, even though India will be okay longer term, in the near term, we think it's very overvalued and is going to come under pressure. Now, India, Vietnam would be two of the ones that I would be looking to buy sooner than the rest, but there's still more pressure and downside in the near term. Then when you look at South Korea, exports were at 3.9%, imports were at 22.1%. So you had that increase in imports. Again, exports will still remain fairly strong, but local demand is slowing with consumer confidence at 88, business survey manufacturing at 82, non-manufacturing 82, slightly better than August, going to September. But inflation keeps going up, which is where PPI remains at over 9% at 9.2%, and the Bank of Japan increased rates again by 25 basis points to 2.5%. Very much expected, and we see more upside as inflation still remains a problem in South Korea. Japan, again, as we said, CPI continues to go up. PMI services came in at 49.2. Composite came in at 48.9. Manufacturing at 51. All on a decelerating, all moving down, now in contraction. Nationwide department store sales came down versus last month at 9.6%. PPI 2.1%, machine tool orders fairly flat. So again, we're still seeing that decelerating component when you're looking at economic activity while inflation still remains elevated. South Korea's central bank, as we said before, up to that 2.5%. We do expect it to get closer to where it was in 2011 and on its way to 3.25%. Taiwan export orders now down below 2021. That's something that we think is going to, again, kind of stabilize here, but still be a bit of an overhang, just given the slowdown in demand for chips after we've had this a fairly sizable catch up in terms of the amount of chips available on the tech side. And then when you look at just the rising sense and some of the things that are with Taiwan and China, which we wanted to round out with, The Taiwanese are continuing to, are more and more identifying as Taiwanese alone. So 63.7% of the people who were polled said they identify as Taiwanese, with 30.4% saying both Taiwanese and Chinese identity. So again, they're getting more of that singular identity, more of just the Taiwanese side, not a China one. And that is, again, that's a generational shift. The Chinese identity in the early 90s was at 30%, is now at 3.5%. So most people either identify as both Chinese Taiwanese or purely Taiwanese, which is leading to more support for independence, more support for being, again, away from and again, more reasons why a unity of both China and Taiwan is impossible without a armed conflict. And I will leave it there. So I appreciate everybody's time and patience watching these. Hopefully I answered questions. If you have any questions, you can find me in the comment section. I'm happy to answer anything I can, or you can find me on Twitter. So again, thanks for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.